When she is not in her Swiftian register, like many of us, Ugresich gains pleasure from contemplating the categories of hybrid cosmopolitan writers into which Dasgupta would fit very well. In an essay tellingly titled, "What is European about European Literature?" Ugresich defines her favorite confounder of categories and canons as Joydip Roy Bhattacharya, Indian name, who steadfastly writes only about Hungary. Presciently, she suggests that it might be simplest to rearrange geopolitical entities into corporations, so that one should refer to oneself as hailing from IKEA or Microsoft, instead of countries. And what about Herta Müller? Have you familiarized yourself at all with Herta Müller? I'm curious. Is she read in Italy much? The new Nobel sensation. She isn't read much in English communities either. Her community is an island of German speakers within Romania. While the community itself was discriminated against, according to her writing, they maintained a certain class confidence or linguistic aplomb in that they had the reassurance of being part of a major global language. This is not dissimilar to my own experience growing up in Australia with German as my mother tongue. While the designation NESB in Australia, non-English speaking background, this was a term that's used, was a primary fault line establishing those who belonged and those who did not enjoy, in the analytical phrase I coined while working there, cultural franchise, the many books my impractical parents brought with them attested to a cultural and linguistic substance that belied the social currency at the time that the post-war immigrants then held, designated either laborer or domestic, not unlike Ugresich's cleaning ladies. Like many other displaced persons in the immediate post-war period, my parents were professionals with university training, so we maintained an awareness of cultural capital, even though this was not a recognition they were accorded by the national culture at the time, not the way in which they were interpolated. The effect on people like myself is that we developed an exilic awareness, whether it be the contrapuntal awareness analyzed by Said, or the double consciousness of the African-American critic Du Bois, he's pronounced, the differently split self of Benvenistian linguistics, énoncé, énonciation, or that of the Christevan subject in process. There's always that sense of that dual perspective. Herta Müller's essay, Der fremde Blick, the strange look, the foreign look, captures this internal discrepant consciousness very well, in a manner that recalls Gilroy's concept of becoming estranged from one's own culture. She raises important questions concerning the ways in which an outsider's or alien's perspective is bracingly useful in terms of nurturing an analytical awareness from an early age. In response to those who welcomed her refreshingly alien critical perspectives to Germany, the place of her mother tongue, Müller maintains that she brought this look with her rather than acquiring it once she arrived in Germany. As a result of being under the surveillance by the Romanian Securitate, she became aware of her everyday domestic reality being displaced in microwaves. Does anyone speak German here? Yeah? Okay. Die Welt baute sich Stück für Stück zusammen gegen den Verstand. The world rebuilt itself piece by piece against understanding. And in another phrase, she speaks of nichtige Dinge mit wichtigen Schatten, lowly objects with significant shadows. And fremd ist für mich nicht das Gegenteil von bekannt, sondern das Gegenteil von vertraut. Strange to me is not the opposite of known, but the opposite of familiar. From this context, she learns to put herself under surveillance and weans herself off the idea that seeing is believing. What she calls intact people she subsequently encounters, those without this split consciousness in her new context, recognize her contrariness and consider it to be inherent, like a character flaw, and that indeed it constitutes the reasons for which she was put under surveillance in the first place. It's sort of that blame the victim mentality. If she was victimized, somehow she was responsible for it. And yet, she argues, the alien gaze has emerged from the familiar things whose taken-for-granted aura has been removed. The literary territory which we are encountering is familiar from Kafka's legacy, among the first to show us the model of the world as self-alienating corporation governed by institutional surveillance. Sort of comes and goes. Okay, it seems to have disappeared. Okay. Okay. The split consciousness described by Müller is reminiscent of both Freud's uncanny, where the familiar becomes suddenly monstrous, and the Lacanian symbolic split when one enters language. However, in Müller's case, this process does not come primarily via the psyche, but from the outside, material reality. It consists of the inability to trust the everyday, much less see it as refuge. There is no stability on which one may stand, even in one's waking conscious moment. This dimension is explored in her early novels, translated into English as The Land of Green Plums. But here already we see a problem with translation. Müller's German is deceptively simple, but is rendered dense by complex wordplay. The title in German for this book is Herztier, and it was not used for the English title and appears to be her invention. My Google translator gives me a direct translation, literal translation, as warm animal, whereas literally it's actually heart beast, right? Used in the course of the English translation. Characteristically, Müller refuses to pin down this enigmatic phrase. It can mean a sense of moral compass, an innermost sensation, perhaps affect in its general sense, but it can also refer to what destroys you. In other words, the nuances of what she's playing with are untranslatable. The Land of Green Plums deals with a group of dissident friends, 3 men and a woman, the narrator, who try to maintain their sanity in Ceausescu's Romania. Under the surveillance of the sinister Captain Piele, complete with dog, a familiar also named Piele, who tells each one of them that they are lucky to have him as interrogator, they are serially undone, even when they have succeeded in escaping from the country. In order to communicate with each other, the group develops an elaborate code which includes enclosing a strand of hair with each letter. To quote, "The word nail clippers in a sentence will mean interrogation," said Kurt. "Shoes will mean a search. A sentence about having a cold will mean you are being followed. After the greeting, always an exclamation point, but a comma if your life is in danger." One can see the rationale for the title because the trope of green plums functions in ways that parallel the toxic contamination of the surveillance state. To quote, "Father says, you can't eat green plums, their pits are still soft, and you'll swallow your death. No one can help them, you just die. The child eats and thinks, this will kill me." Of the 4 friends, only 2 survive. The other 2 ostensibly commit suicide, but it is never clear whether in fact their deaths are due to the long and vengeful reach of Captain Piele, even outside the country. As for the 2 survivors, they are left bereft of any beliefs in the redemptive power of friendship, or indeed that there are any hopeful human qualities remaining. This too is cosmopolitan allegory, but in its most dystopian form. The seesawing between an adult's and child's point of view possibly alludes to the discredited East German writer Christa Wolf. In We the People of Europe, Reflections on Transnational Citizenship, Etienne Balibar ponders whether the essential function of Europe might not be as interpreter of the world that draws on its repository of very diverse intellectuals. Consider the following. To quote him, "The idea of the vanishing mediator is probably not so different from the idea of the translator, the intermediary, or the traveler that I have associated with the essential function of the intellectual. It is an attractive thought, and certainly the writers I've been assembling here are both translators and intellectuals, but are not necessarily recognized for being so." And my last example returns us to Australia and is a conspicuous case in point. And it's that last section, being interpolated as stranger, the stranger imagining home. Born of Greek parents in Romania, Antigone Kepala has resided in Australia for over 40 years and has worked as an arts administrator. She's also written in English all this time, but is consistently regarded, like Manjamele and many others, as an eternal foreigner. Here's an extract from her latest book called Sydney Journals to illustrate the point, and I quote, "The long haul. We are already somewhere near Tashkent, where Akhmatova and Nadezhda Mandelstam lived during the war. Food is being served. Across the aisle, we smile at each other. 'Are you holidaying in Sydney?' she asks. 'No, I'm going home.' A slight surprise in her face. 'Home to Sydney.' When we finally arrive, we fly over the Opera House, the bridge. I am very pleased. I am pleased with the blueness of the sky. I am pleased as if I had a hand in making the place." It's all kind of works towards that last sentence. Kefala's book is divided into 10 sections that comprise aphoristic comments on travels that take place as much in the mind as across different geographies. The dynamic for the book, like all of Kefala's work, is to transform what is perceived by her immediate Anglophone Australian readers as an isolated idiolect, characterized repeatedly as those of an alien, into a sociolect, the gift of an erudite sensibility, writing to expand the cultural horizons of her compatriots. While Kefala's voice is indisputably particular, the cultural grammar it invokes should be more familiar in Australia than has to date been the case, given the extent of Anglo-Celtic elements in the country. Kefala's narratorial eye links Australia and Europe in the kinds of affective psychogeographies that are only just beginning to be acknowledged. The narratorial voice converses with writers, artists, family friends who are part of a continuing dialogue that is completely present and embodied, even when they are encountered as part of literary and textual traditions. Thus, the Mandelstams, Akhmatova, and Sepharis populate the text as substantively as friends and family. Just as it is sometimes hard to know whether the meditations and dialogues take place in Australia or Europe, so it is difficult to place them precisely in a temporal sense. The effect is dreamlike, and indeed dreams punctuate the entries and are as viscerally felt as other experiences, a characteristic of all Kefala's work. The result is a palimpsest both here and there, unsettlingly both familiar and strange, with the added dimension of making readers see and feel what we thought we knew differently. The Europe that inhabits Kefala's Australia is a melancholic and layered set of densely conceived interlocutors, aesthetic categories, and unsettling artists, very different from the dead Europe theme park mordantly conceptualized by Christos. To cite another passage from Kefala, it seemed that none of them had heard someone with a different accent for some time. They were listening to me politely, with an increased amount of attention, as if I were an invalid, so that the air became charged while I spoke. Europe is mapped onto Australia as one would expect, given that there has been a European presence, and not just in Anglo-Celtic terms, for many decades. It also takes the form of feeling that she is not entitled to use the language of the country. To quote, "Trying to write, one needs so much confidence in oneself to carry even a sentence. The moment the level goes down, one realizes the futility of all things, the thin nature of the enterprise and language that refuses to work." A Europeanness that is idiosyncratically conceived by all those who are linked to its varied histories are the necessarily differentiated versions produced by vernacular cosmopolitans. So let me conclude with another subtly illuminating passage from Kefala's Sydney Journals. "I realized how environments form us, all these European landmarks that totally lose their meaning in another culture, personalities we were brought up with, writers that have no resonance at all in this culture. No one knows these things except us. A secret knowledge, meaningless to people outside the old culture. And all this illusion of universalities, internationalism."